You're now watching Around the Horn, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald.
Today is July 2nd, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horn, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now in print and now available on the International Publisher's website, is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horn.
Thank you for inviting me.
Horn, as we go around the horn, as we approach the vaunted July 4th holiday, I want to ask you about so-called Independence Day. And as you have done more research and written more on the history and founding of the U.S., both leading up to and following July 4th, 1776, we want to ask you, how should we be analyzing Independence Day, and is it time that we should be reconsidering 1776?
Oh, it's well past time. I mean, this is the time of year when we, in a macabre fashion, mark and celebrate white supremacy, settler colonialism, genocide, and mass enslavement. And I'm not exaggerating one iota. In fact, I just finished this new book, which is symptomatic and indicative of the new scholarship. It's called The Business of Killing Indians, Scout Warfare and the Violent Conquest of North America. Now, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, has spoken about how the United States is monetizing hegemony or U.S. imperial dominance. The way this continent was conquered by the settlers was by monetizing killing Native Americans. As I pointed out a few weeks ago in terms of my research on the U.S. Pacific Northwest, when the military became reluctant to continue liquidating Native Americans, the settlers themselves organized brigades. And as this book I just held up points out, this was nothing new. In fact, states like California oftentimes gave a stipend for every scalp that a settler brought in. That is to say, either the hair or the head of a Native American. And this is what we're supposed to celebrate on July 4th. It's really scandalous. And if we don't understand the origins of this nation, it's hard to plot strategy. Imagine if the folks in the settlements on the West Bank were seeing themselves as being the embodiment of a great leap forward for humanity. If you were a dissident on the West Bank, which of course is highly unlikely, how could you credibly plot a strategy that would lead to victory? Likewise, in 1965, the settlers in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, revolted. They said that they were walking in the footsteps of 1776. And of course, they were seeking to establish an apartheid-like regime. Imagine if there had been Africans who tended to go along with this cockamamie idea that establishing an apartheid regime was a great leap forward for humanity. But fundamentally, that's what we've done here in North America. I think it's important, it's well past time to recognize that what drove the formation of the United States of America were material considerations. That is to say, the desire to continue seizing the land of the Native Americans. Recall, as I pointed out more than once, that in 1762, 1763, London had expressed displeasure at continuing to subsidize the British Army in mowing down Native Americans as the settlers moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This obviously did not please George Washington. And in my latest book, The Capital of Slavery, I was able to look at his will and able to ascertain that he may have been the largest landowner on planet Earth, not least because of his energy in leading the mowing down of Native Americans. And then, of course, there was a question of labor, land and labor. That is to say, in 1772, London, for various reasons, had seemed to suggest that it was moving towards abolition of enslavement, which enraged those settlers on these shores whose major investment was in the bodies of enslaved Africans. Land and labor led to a revolt against British rule, establishing the United States of America. In 1776, there were 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. And of course, many of our naive, disingenuous historians don't ask the fundamental question, which is why Quebec, which was under the British flag, did not revolt. Of course, that would tend to upset their apple cart. And so we see that in 1776, there were 13 colonies. By 1861, the United States had spread to the Pacific. In 1776, there were thousands of enslaved Africans. By 1861, on the verge of the Civil War, there were millions. And supposedly, many of our historians who are teaching your children and your nieces and nephews are telling them as we speak that this liquidation of Native Americans and mass enslavement of Africans somehow amounted to a great leap forward for humanity, despite the fact that we've known for centuries, if not decades, that Africans by several orders of magnitude did not support the revolt against British rule and continued to express their displeasure in succeeding decades. Fortunately, there is a growing historiography that challenges the old-time religion. I'm thinking of the book White Freedom by the late Fordham Dean Tyler Stovall. Even Nicole Hannah-Jones of Howard University, her 1619 project, which outraged the White House, leans in the direction that I'm now advocating. And I should also mention the fundamental point in terms of political strategy. That is to say, as we speak in Washington, D.C., the so-called Big Beautiful Bill is being passed, which are attempted to be passed, I should say, because there's still a chance that it won't be passed. But if it does pass, it'll be the largest redistribution of wealth from bottom to top, perhaps in the history of this country. And if this were a parliamentary system and we were able to have a snap election, you would be unwise to think that Donald J. Trump would be defeated. Because, of course, settler colonialism established in 1776 is based upon class collaboration. That is to say, the collaboration between the poor amongst the settlers and the settler descendants and the richer amongst the settlers and settler descendants. It's not unlike the U.S. Civil War, when you had thousands of settler foot soldiers fighting to preserve a system of slavery, even though slavery would ultimately, if left intact, drive down their wages and working conditions. And so if you don't understand class collaboration, then you won't understand settler colonialism, which means you will not be able to understand how we reach this dilemma that we now find ourselves facing. And I should say that in order to break the logjam, what happened was that we internationalized the struggle. We were in solidarity with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which ignited a general crisis of the slave system, which is one of the reasons why Mr. Trump to this very day is going after Haitians in the United States, about to deport tens of thousands if he has his way. And of course, in the 20th century, we continued that tradition by aligning with the socialist camp, aligning with national liberation movements. Unfortunately, what happened in the 1950s was that the leadership of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a mass organization, decided to toss overboard the Black Internationalists led by Paul Robeson in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions. Unfortunately for us and for them, there is an expiration date on that Faustian bargain, which is expiring as we speak. Interestingly enough, the NAACP is holding its annual convention in a few days in Charlotte, North Carolina. And in the run-up and the prelude to that convention, their leader has spoken of the whiff of fascism that's invading our nostrils. Now, of course, he has not sought to explain how fascism arose on the shores of a country which we were told has been a great leap forward for humanity. And in any case, we would be well and we would be wise to remind the NAACP leadership of that Faustian bargain that they brokered some decades ago. And in terms of repairing the damage that was done, in the first instance, they should apologize to Robeson's descendants. And in the second instance, they should reverse the course established some decades ago, where they broke away from internationalism and, of course, broke away from the organized left in addition.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, I want to ask you about the New York City Mayoral Race. Last Wednesday, June 25th, the day after Zohran Mamdani's shocking upset went over former Governor Andrew Cuomo, the current mayor of New York City, Mayor Eric Adams, took to a friendly forum, Fox and Friends, to attack the progressive Mamdani, grabbing national headlines by referring Mamdani as a snake oil salesman. Adams' combativeness signals what his campaign has described as the next phase of the 2025 mayoral race. Mayor Adams went on to say that, quote, "What NYC deserves is a mayor who's proud to run on his record, not one who ran from his record, or one who has no record. And we deserve a mayor who will keep driving down crime, support our police, fight anti-Semitism, and stand up for working-class New Yorkers." Dr. Horne, while many think that Mamdani's primary election win was his major hurdle, it seems that things are only just heating up in NYC. But what is your analysis of the New York City mayoral race?
Well, I think it's important to point out that it is acceptable, if not mandatory, to criticize Mr. Mamdani, to criticize the Democratic Socialists of America, the Social Democrats, the organization whose banner he carries. It's justifiable to criticize myself, for example. But we should not substitute or not confuse those sorts of criticisms with the hard task of engaging in political analysis, and more particularly electoral analysis. As I've said in another context, with regard to certain critics of the entire process of voting, we should see votes and voting as a tool. Fire can be used to temper steel, to build a bridge, and fire can be used to burn down a bridge. And so we see that with regard to this election, we see positive consequences even before the November final tally is rendered. That is to say, socialism has been injected into the popular discourse, a significant ideological victory, not least because of the administrations of Mr. Mamdani. We see as well that the 1% in New York are in high dudgeon. It's fair to say that they're freaking out because Mr. Mamdani has pledged to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if he shows up in Gotham. Gotham, of course, is the major citadel of the Zionist establishment in the United States of America, so it's little wonder why they're shaken. But at the same time, there's some difficult questions to answer and to examine. For example, Mr. Mamdani did not win the black vote in this primary. Andrew Cuomo, the sex pest and bigot, won the black vote. But we need to understand a few points in order to shed light on that particular issue. For example, we know that in November 2024, two stalwart black members of Congress, speaking of Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman of Bronx Westchester, both were defeated because they were perceived as being overly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and significantly opposed to genocide. The Zionist establishment went after them and claimed victory when they were defeated. This, I'm sure, was weighing on the minds of many in the black community who were perhaps thinking that Mr. Mamdani's stances were close to that of Bush and Bowman, which would lead to his defeat. And then likewise, refer to what I just said a moment or two ago, which is too often ignored, which is that historically, going back over the last 70, 80 years, you had a retreat of Jim Crow combined with an attack on socialists like Paul Robeson. And that recipe, I am certain, still weighs like an anchor, weighs like an Alp on the minds of those still living in Gotham. And then, of course, there's what the late Glenn Ford used to call the misleadership class. I'm thinking of Hakeem Jeffries of Brooklyn, the so-called speaker in waiting. I'm thinking of Greg Meeks of Southeast Queens, for example, who, by the way, shares neighborhood turf with Eric Adams, the corrupt, scandal-ridden former cop mayor. And to my knowledge, even though they are leaders of the Democratic Party, they have yet to endorse the Democratic nominee for mayor, and of course, were lukewarm at best with regard to Mr. Mamdani in the run-up to this election. Likewise, to continue this sort of analysis, it's striking that Andrew Cuomo apparently won the Bronx, which is a heavily black and brown borough of Gotham, for example. That's quite staggering and stunning in retrospect. We should not be surprised, of course, that Mr. Cuomo did quite well on Staten Island, which is in many ways the headquarters of the Euro-American working class. And of course, he did quite well amongst the 1% on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and to a degree on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So what I'm trying to suggest is that in order to understand this election in Gotham, it's important not only to look at the real and imagined debilities and weaknesses of the Social Democrats, of Mr. Mamdani, but it's important to put that in the context of an overall granular analysis of the electorate, and of course, not at all downplaying or downgrading the already significant victories that have emerged since this election in the last few days, amongst which is the reintroduction of the concept of socialism in the mainstream. That is to say, it's not beyond the realm of imagination that the mayor of the capital of the capitalist world, speaking of New York City, will be a socialist with a program determined to redistribute the wealth, unlike what's happening in Washington, D.C. as we speak, where the wealth is being redistributed from the bottom to top. Mr. Mamdani is talking about from the top to the bottom.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about Iran. On June 26th, in a televised message, the third since June 13th, when the Israeli regime launched its unprovoked aggression against the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei said the Zionist regime was crushed under the blows of the Iranian armed forces. In his message following the end of the Israeli aggression against the Islamic Republic and the regime's unilateral declaration of a ceasefire, the leader of the Islamic Revolution on Thursday congratulated the Iranian nation on its glorious victory. Ayatollah Khamenei stated, quote, "I feel it is necessary to extend several congratulations to the great Iranian nation. First, congratulations on the victory over the fake Zionist regime. Despite all its noise and claims, the Zionist regime was nearly brought to its knees and crushed under the blows of the Islamic Republic." Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to Ayatollah Khamenei's televised message on June 26th? And do you think he overstated how much of a victory this was for Iran and how much of a loss it was for Israel and the U.S. as well?
Well, to be sure, Iran got its nose bloodied, particularly on the morning of June 13th, when in a James Bond-type escapade, the Israelis were able to invade the capital of Iran and liquidate in their beds nuclear scientists and military leaders. But within hours, Iran had regained its footing and began launching missiles into Tel Aviv and Haifa, shutting down Ben Gurion Airport, virtually destroying the Weizmann Institute, which is Israel's version of Silicon Valley, attacking apparently Dimona, where their nuclear weapons and nuclear arsenal is stored, attacking military bases, attacking the Mossad headquarters, that is to say, the Israeli version of the Central Intelligence Agency. And so it's clear that Iran executed withering blows against the Zionist regime, which is one of the reasons why on Monday, July 7th, Mr. Netanyahu, the prime minister, will be in Washington, D.C., conferring with Mr. Trump, because I don't think that this war has ended. I think that the Israelis are reloading, and if the Iranians are smart, they too will reload, because even though Mr. Trump has suggested that the Iranian nuclear capability was, quote, obliterated, unquote. Now, let's set aside for a moment the fact that Israel has nuclear capability, albeit unacknowledged, and yet they're demanding somehow that Iran not be allowed that same right, for example. But we already see that with the Iranian authorities turning against the International Atomic Energy Agency, headed by Rafael Grossi, who, as we've reported multiple times in recent weeks, has been unmasked as a kind of de facto agent of Israel and the United States. That is to say, he and his team go in and do inspections of Iranian nuclear facilities and then turn over the intelligence to the Israelis so that they can catch Iranian nuclear scientists napping in their beds and then execute them. And so the new play will be that in light of Iran turning its back on the IAEA, the United States will argue that despite the previous claim of obliteration, there are now Iranian attempts to enrich uranium to what the United States would consider to be an exceedingly high level, not to mention developing a nuclear weapons capability, despite the fact that the Ayatollah has issued a fatwa against the development of nuclear weapons, which will then provide a pretext for round two of this U.S.-Israeli war against Iran. However, Iran, as we know, has not been asleep at the switch since this first phase of the so-called 12-day war has ended. The defense minister was in China recently, meeting with other defense ministers from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which simplistically is a counterpoint of NATO led by Daddy Trump. And we also know that Iran is in the process of receiving jet fighters from the People's Republic of China. I would imagine that their air missile defense is being beefed up by the Russians. And we also see, in terms of doing self-criticism, to the extent that that useful exercise is still deployed, that many of our friends on the left need to engage in that process in light of the fact that many of them acted as cheerleaders when the al-Assad regime in Damascus, Syria, was overthrown, replaced by al-Qaeda light in the form of Mr. al-Shara, Mr. Julani, the de facto leader of Syria. Mr. Trump has just eased sanctions against Syria. This has been a major victory for the Israelis, who were able to join hands with Damascus, because the new regime claims that it is a sworn foe of both Iran and Iran's comrades in Lebanon in terms of Hezbollah. Likewise, I would say that we need to play up on the tensions and contradictions in the North Atlantic camp. Mr. Macron of France said that this U.S. attack on Iran was, quote, illegal, unquote. Mr. Macron of France also just yesterday had a 2-hour conversation with Vladimir Putin in Russia, their first acknowledged conversation since the special military operation in Ukraine of February 2022. This perhaps will lead to a reshuffling of the deck. At least we can hope that it does. And in any case, it's apparent that Israel is going to find it difficult, if round two commences within the next week or so, will find it difficult to stand up to the withering blows administered by the Iranian authorities. And I should also mention that it will not be easy for the United States to bring in more so-called THAAD missiles and other forms of air missile defense, such as the Patriot system. In fact, you can connect this recent news item that suggests that the U.S. is cutting back on those similar systems going to Ukraine because they're scrambling to try to supply them to Israel. And so we see that no matter how you slice it, the imperialist camp, led by the United States with its sidekick in Israel, is under pressure. And I would hope that our mass movement can take to the streets and convince U.S. imperialism not to go over the top, not to launch another round of missiles against Iran, not least because, of course, it could lead to a further diplomatic isolation and worse of U.S. imperialism.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about Israel. This past Monday, June 30th, it was announced that President Donald Trump will host Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for talks at the White House next Monday, July 7th, as Trump steps up his push on Israel to broker a ceasefire in Gaza. The trip will be Netanyahu's third visit to the White House since Trump returned to office in January. And after the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, Trump has signaled that he's turning his attention to trying to broker a ceasefire between Israel and Palestinians in Gaza. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this news of Netanyahu's third and upcoming visit to Washington, and how optimistic are you regarding a ceasefire between Israel and Palestinians in Gaza?
Well, as we came to air, the news was emerging that apparently there's no consensus between the Israeli authorities and their opponents in Hamas with regard to this so-called ceasefire, which would involve releasing of the Israelis who the Hamas has held at least since October 7, 2023. We look with concern, to put it mildly, on the continuing slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, particularly turning depots where Palestinians are supposedly going to gather food into massacre and slaughter sites. Once again, I hope that Mr. Netanyahu decides to visit the United States once more by the end of the year, when presumably there will be a new mayor in Gotham. And if he dares to go to Zionist headquarters in Manhattan, hopefully he will find himself under arrest and bundled up and dispatched forthwith to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where he should rightfully stand trial for crimes against humanity.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about the news that the president of Ghana, John Dramani Mahama, recently disclosed that the United States, via the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, was responsible for the removal of Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah. Speaking at the 68th Independence Day celebration of Ghana on March 6, 2025, President Mahama revealed that declassified U.S. intelligence documents show that it was the CIA who orchestrated the coup that ousted President Nkrumah while he was out of the country. It was Kwame Nkrumah's foreign minister, Alex Kwesi, who was handsomely paid by the CIA and promised the presidency in exchange for his role in facilitating Nkrumah's removal. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this revelation by President Mahama and the role of the CIA in ousting Nkrumah?
Well, we've known about this for quite some time, although I'm happy to see that President Mahama is confirming what we have already believed and thought. I should also say that the NAACP is implicated in this dirty business, because recall that at the time of Nkrumah's overthrow, the U.S. ambassador was Franklin Williams, a Black American, a former leader of the NAACP, and his getting that high-level post was part of that Faustian bargain I made reference to a few moments ago. That is to say, with the NAACP turning against the organized left led by Paul Robeson, there would be various emoluments, various cushy posts that would be offered to NAACP leaders. But alas, that bargain, as noted, has expired, just like our time has expired, and I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people. say.